What's up, everybody? Straight Outta Fresno podcast, episode 8. Thank you guys for tuning to another episode again. I appreciate all your support on all of our platforms so far. We got two special guests. We got from State of Murder podcast. We have Celina Cooper and we have Amber Ratzlaff. How are you both doing?
Good.
Good. Yeah.
Just making it through the bad air quality one day at a time.
Right. I know I went outside last night and it was worse, I think, than it's ever been. Like the visibility wasn't even that far. So and you can feel it. You can feel it in your lungs. It's just a terrible feeling.
Yeah, it is. It's been rough.
Yeah. Nothing like breathing in some ash.
Yeah.
Right. Seriously. Yeah. It's not a good look at all. Not a good look at all. Especially in the valley where, so many people have asthma or respiratory issues. It's rough. All right. Well, yes. I mean, let's talk State of Murder podcast. I've been tuning in since you guys have initially started. I think it's fun. I think it's entertaining. I think it's informational as well. So I definitely appreciate it. But let's talk about State of Murder. First off, what is State of Murder podcast?
So we love true crime. It was something that came to us. We listened to a lot of true crime podcasts and we were like, hey, we're funny. Like, we could do this. Like, we like talking about it and doing the research. So we just kind of decided, let's take this seriously and let's plan it out. So.
Yeah. Celina and I worked in the same office at 2 different jobs and it was just us for months on end doing very little. And so I think that's what it stemmed from, is just building on like just our little chats and then going, hey, maybe this would be interesting for other people.
Yeah. And I think finding that core interest is crucial, obviously, to have two people, join on a podcast to talk about it. But where does that intrigue for true crime come from for both of you?
Want to start?
Okay. I think mine started, I was fairly young, so I've always been just obsessed with mobsters, and I'm totally into history, so that's where I got my first degree in, was history, and so kind of like finding out like what's happened in the past and how history keeps repeating itself. And so when I was 13, we actually did the case, I'm from Nebraska, and so we did the case Charles Starkweather. And it was a made-for-TV movie that I watched of that story, and I just was totally drawn in. And as we talk about in that episode, a little attracted to him. And so it was kind of weird as this 13-year-old to be like, oh, this mass murderer is kind of like hot. And so after that, I just would, any case that I found interesting, I would just kind of read on it and just be really engaged in it. And so my parents were freaked out for a really, really long time about it, because they're like, is this a normal thing? But as you see in the world today, it is pretty normal that people are into true crime.
Yeah. And I think for me, growing up in Fresno, I think in middle school, I was in middle school around the time of the Marcus Wesson case that we did in our very first episode. Yeah. And that was kind of what sparked it too, of the idea of doing these lesser known true crimes, because Marcus Wesson was such a big news thing around Fresno, and you couldn't really get enough of what happened and the weird twists and turns the case took. And so for me, it was like, how have I never heard about this on any of the other podcasts we listened to? You don't really hear about it even now. And it was probably, it was a huge mass murder and a huge tragedy, and all of these things happened. And so, that was my intro to true crime. And ever since then, it was serial killers, mobsters, any kind of true crime, I was there. So.
Right. And we'll get back to Marcus Wesson in a second, because I did enjoy and appreciate that was your first episode. Obviously, growing up in Fresno, born and raised, that was like you said, we covered that literally every single day on the news, and it was always kind of what's the next update? So we'll get back to that a little bit, but let's focus on the intrigue around true crime, because Amber, just like you mentioned, it's not just you, it's a lot of people, all around the US, all around the world in general. What's your theory about people's natural instinction to just enjoy true crime stories? Why do you think that that's such a hot button?
I think it's and maybe because of my psychology background, it's just so interesting to me what makes people do these things, and how do we get from A to B, basically. How do we come from being innocent children to all of a sudden growing up to be these kinds of criminals? And so just really like the why behind it. Like, what is it happens? Because in a lot of our cases that you look at, there was a lot of trauma in the background of the perpetrators of these crimes. And I think it was the Louisiana episode with my case, we talked about it, where, I mean, technically I looked at it as two victims, because the perpetrator, he was a victim with PTSD, and he came back and he did really terrible things, but it was hard for me to look at him solely as a perpetrator of this crime because of all of the things he had gone through and what led him, and the lack of care and all of these things. So I think it's just interesting for people to look at tiny little changes in your own timeline could have ended up with a completely different result in how you behaved, I guess. So that's my theory.
Yeah, I go with that too. And also I think people just like that kind of horror genre and kind of macabre things. And so you have this kind of darkness and the fact that it's out there. So it kind of is scary that it could happen to anybody, and that draws you in, I think. And just the unknown. And also you see horror films and you're like, okay, oh, that can't happen in real life. And then you hear these stories and you're like, oh shit, it can really happen in real life, and also worse than a lot of horror stories. And so I think that's what really draws people in.
Yeah, no, I think definitely that possibility that this is real, people hone in on that. Like when you hear about Texas Chainsaw Massacre and it's based on a true story, it's like, wait. Like, okay, this could possibly happen. Could, another episode ultimately happen somewhere else, around the US? So I think that people do hone in on that possible reality. And I think for the most part, we as humans, we do want to kind of relate to a situation. So if it's something that's so bizarre and so unknown, I think it kind of sparks our curiosity. And we're like, could we find ourselves in that situation? Oh, wow. How could, a murderer, we want to know their backstory. We want to know what led to them getting to that point. I think when we realize that sometimes their childhoods were similar to ours, it's like haunting, because like one or two things could have just completely thrown us off of the rails, similar to some of these murderers. So I think you can go on and on about it. And obviously, Celina, with your with your both of your psychology backgrounds, you know more than I do. It's just intriguing to theorize about the whole thing and why it's just so popular amongst pop culture. So yeah, definitely. So far, what has been your favorite, I guess without being insensitive, what's been your favorite state that you have researched cases on?
Oh, I don't know. I feel like I had a few good cases throughout.
Absolutely.
I mean, Louisiana was definitely an interesting state to do because, like I said, it was one of those where they were kind of both victims in that. And it was probably by far my most gruesome case, which, like I said, I mean, I don't want to be it's just interesting to talk about. Like, it's such a straight out of a horror movie type thing. That for me, Louisiana and Utah, I think, where I did the high five murders. That one was pretty intense too.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a favorite. Since I really like history, I think probably my favorites were, for me, Oklahoma, just because both of our cases were historical and both are very marginalized populations. And so having that opportunity to tell stories of African Americans and Native American Indians and horrors that happened to them, I think I really enjoyed researching that case. But I would say probably the funnest case was for me, when was it, when Ken McElroy and the vigilante justice of a whole town that ended up killing him because he was just a town bully. And like, even though we don't know who the murderer specifically is, it's just kind of like that uprising of, we're not going to take it anymore. And how can a town get to that point? And could we get to that point? So I think that's probably one of my, I'm going to say, funnest cases.
Yeah.
Because really the bad guy is the one that ended up dead.
Right. And it's interesting just to kind of go over the format of how you do your episodes. You typically do 2 per state, a state for an episode. So how do you decide, Celina, I'm going to do this case for an episode, Amber, I'm going to do this case for an episode? Obviously you have such a wide array of selection.
Yeah, so I think it's more, now that we're getting into states that we haven't really been to or know a whole lot about. It's really just doing deep dive Google searches. We really want to try to do not just like lesser known, but maybe less reported on cases, which is I think why it works well that we each do a case, because sometimes our stories can be a little short because we can only find so much, but it's really deep dive. I try to go to like 5th, 6th page of Google searches to find things or look up different types of terms, specific cities that I know of, to try to find things that weren't typically covered. And it's really just, I read through an article, if it sounds like something that should have been more reported on, or something that just there's something interesting about it, or a special twist that I want to talk about, or even I think lately a lot of our cases have political leanings to it. So talking about, or like hot button topics, talking about the criminal justice system, police brutality, talking about, like Amber said, with Oklahoma, that was a really powerful episode for us because these were such huge events, like the Osage Indian massacre and the Tulsa race massacre. And these are things that we never really learned about in school and never talked about. So, I mean, just, it was something interesting for us, something that we can have more of a discussion about is what helps me.
Yeah. So I'll read, and I love reading. I'm an avid reader. So if I can find a book on something, even though I try to always do a case I've never heard about it. 3 times, because I've known about the Wesson case, and then states that I've lived in. So 2 of those cases I obviously knew about. But other than that, I try to be like, have I heard about this story? And since I do listen to a lot of true crime, I've followed true crime for a really long time. If I haven't heard about it, I'm like, okay, probably the majority of the people that are listening haven't heard this story. And so then I'm going to share it. So that's kind of how I pick it.
Yeah. And I think that that's very important, because I remember from the first episode, I think you both kind of, reaffirmed, hey, we're not doing the well-known cases. We're not doing the popular ones. You could do a simple Google search. First 2 results are going to tell you pretty much 90% of what you need to know. So I think on the underrepresented cases or the lesser known ones is pretty crucial. Amber, going back to the Oklahoma episode and talking about, like the Tulsa race massacre, for example, that does have a historical standpoint. And I think not knowing those things does kind of play into how the world sees, issues of race and discrimination today, just because of simple, misinformation or just not being informed at all, on these topics. How do you guys, perceive that?
I mean, I think we talk, and we mention it and talk about it, that media picks ones that they think everybody is going to have a draw to. And sadly, that typically is, white women, blonde white women that are attractive, cute little white kids that are going missing. And so it's such an unfair thing in our culture that has become such a reality that so many people don't get their stories told. So even with Celina's story that she told for this last week's episode for Illinois, I mean, that's a terrible, sad story about this little boy. And I've never heard about that. Yeah. And I think we drew comparisons in that episode as well. Like, here was this young African-American boy who died in this very tragic way and didn't get the justice that he deserved. Whereas we never heard about it, and I think we heard about it for weeks, about the little boy who tragically wandered into where alligators were in Disneyland or Disney World, and he was eaten. And yes, that's a tragedy and it's upsetting, but I mean, we know what happened. It was a tragic accident. Yes, be sad about it, but there's something that maybe more outreach might have helped this young boy in Chicago find justice, or I just felt like there should have been more reported on. And so those kinds of cases we want to bring light to, because I mean, they're important. People need to hear about them. Yes, we don't want our news feed being tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, but some of these do require more attention and they should be heard about.
Right. And I think a lot of the cases that you guys have talked about typically end up in some sort of resolution, via the criminal justice system. And hey, someone was found guilty of it, or whatever the case is. How do you guys feel about cold cases and investigating cold cases, because those you can kind of almost get into conspiracy theories, just because there is no end. We can't safely assume or safely believe that, yes, this is the end result, John Doe did this and, led to this.
Yeah, and I think we have done a few about like missing women. I know I did one about the missing women in Missouri that kind of, they have an idea of who might have done it, but there's no way to prove it. And it's hard, I think, for us in terms of like, we don't know. And it's hard. We can do as much research as we want, but we know just about as much as everyone else. So I think using our podcast as a platform as well of saying, hey, we have listeners all over. If you do know something about this, or if this sparks some type of memory for you, report it, send in your tip lines. I mean, we've referenced a couple tip lines that can help out.
And with cold cases, it's a cold case for, the police, but it's not a cold case for the families typically that, have had either their loved ones missing or has been murdered and they found the body. And so it doesn't end for them. And even though, especially ones, if they find the body, it's like, yes, they know what happened necessarily to the victim, but then it's like, you still want to know. And then also the scary thought of, those people are all still out there. And you take a look at, the Golden State Killer. So we talk about, we never shared his story, but he's one that's always in the news. He was just in the news this week. And so that was a cold case for 40 years. And they didn't even know, like California didn't even know it was the same person. So they had, the rapist and then the murders, and they were all over like Central California. And nobody even linked them for decades. And then it turned out to be one guy, and you're like, holy crap, and so all these cold cases got solved with just this one man. It's just like,
we talk about familial DNA, and it's helped solve a few of the cases that we've talked about. And so just bringing that more into light. I know we promoted, I think with the Angie Dodge case, and there was another case that was familial DNA that you had where we talked about, hey, if you want to do one of those Ancestry 23andMe things, you can check a box that lets your DNA get inputted into this database that could help solve the case, because somebody like way removed from your family line could have committed this crime, because that was the case with Angie Dodge's cases. They almost got the wrong guy, but it turns out it was like, I think it was like 3 times removed from his family. They just happened to share DNA and it wasn't reported. So he actually made a documentary and like deep dove in it with her mom, and they found her killer years later. And so, yeah, just encouraging our listeners to.
Although then the scary part with that is like, okay, if I put my DNA in and then all of a sudden my family is linked to a murder, oh my God. But is that good or bad? I don't know.
Yeah, there's always that to think about as well. The aspect of DNA I think is so intriguing, because had we had, DNA, or I guess DNA, testing and stuff be so prevalent as it is today, just think about how many unsolved murders would have been solved, at that point of time back then. A lot of cases, we're kind of able to lean on, I guess, a little more, what am I trying to say? A little less substantial, evidence, enough, but still be enough to convict, because you don't have all these other outlets to where you can almost, to 99%, conviction, believe that this person committed the crime that, they're being accused of. So I think that's really played a huge part in, a lot of unsolved, murders that are still out there and things like that. I mean, we kind of even hear about things nowadays where, just like with the Golden State Killer, oh wait, that was the same person. We were now able to find that out, but we couldn't, back in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s about that. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your research, because you guys, I appreciate the level of research that you guys put into it. It's not just a simple, let's pull up the Wikipedia page and we're just going to read off of the Wikipedia page. I mean, we're talking, you guys go through, court case files if they're available. You go through books, you go through, pages and pages of, news outlets and videos and stuff like that. So talk about, that research, how much time and energy that you guys put into finding information about these cases.
I think it depends. Sometimes, like, so for the Marcus Wesson case, because that was our first one, and because we we're new to podcasting, so we kind of took our time with getting that case done. That took a few weeks of research. I read a book, and then I think I skimmed through another one, read one complete one. I know we looked at news articles, So I would say anywhere from like a week to even just a few days of like straight up 24 hours. This is what we're doing. We're just like cramming and researching article after article. We definitely Google if we can find court cases, just because that you'll notice as you look through stuff, and we mentioned it a few times as well, like we try not to repeat things that are only found in one article. Like if they mention it in a few, then we'll talk about it, because things get so twisted. I've read court cases and then looked at the news article and I'm like, that is not at all like the timeline of what happened. But I mean, it's kind of like the game telephone, is over time things get changed and people interpret it on their own, so that way they're not plagiarizing and little details get changed. So
and a lot of times when you are talking about murder, the only one that really has any information to share is the murderer. And so it's like, how much do you put stock into what they're actually saying occurred? And so I always am very like straightforward on, okay, this is what they reported. I don't know if this is true, but we're going to give their side of the story. Sometimes what was it, 2 weeks ago, when I started like looking into the alt-right. And so when you get into these cases and you find so much information, it kind of sometimes splits you off into directions that you never anticipated, because I don't know anything about the alt-right, because that's not something I ever really wanted to know about. And so, but I needed to, because I wanted to understand what drove this man to commit the Sikh massacre. And so it was like, okay, so I'm going to look into that and where he started getting his ideas. And so I had to figure out, because there's sometimes when you're like, oh, I have no idea even what this is or what this means. What is this group? And so that's when you have to really start diving even deeper so that you can report and share some information that people probably don't know.
Right. And I definitely appreciate your perspective of acknowledging, different points of view, regarding a case. Because just like you said, most of it does come from, the murderer or whatever the murderer has divulged. You don't always get to hear, different points of view from other potential suspects, or from, the victim themselves, or survivors, or, family members of the victims, things like that. So you guys do approach a lot of those different angles. And I like how it ultimately comes down to hey, this is us reporting the facts. This is, us reporting different perspectives. It kind of like leaves the listener to just say, you decide, you do your own research as well and kind of figure out where you stand on this issue. So I think that is definitely pretty cool on how you guys approach that. So let's go back to Marcus Wesson, because I think that was one that, Celina, like you said earlier, that jarred the entire community. I appreciate that episode because you guys taught me a lot of things that I never heard on the news before, regarding that case. In a nutshell, the news kind of just stuck to like the cliff notes, ultimately, in regards to the case. And we just wanted to know if he was going to be guilty or not. So I think that was definitely cool how you guys approached a lot of those different facts and presented new things, new information to people that, I guess I can say I lived through it, having been in during the time. But what did you guys learn about that case? I know, Amber, obviously you're from Nebraska, but you've been in Fresno for quite some time.
Yeah, I had lived in Fresno. I moved actually that year that it happened. So that was like one of the very first news things that happened when I moved to Fresno. And then I was like, holy shit. Like
back or,
No, I was like, okay, what's this? What is this? So I'm trying to think where
something new. So I was in middle school, so I was kind of going off what was in the news or newspapers at the time. And like you said, they really didn't, I guess, do it justice or talk too much about the details. And we talk about it in that episode as well. Like, why wasn't there as much interest in the whys behind stuff? Because there was a lot of weird things. Like, I think the whole idea of like the vampire writing, like changing the Bible, that was an interesting thing because we looked at it as like, okay, it's this case of murder and incest, and like that on its own is very shocking. But I think a lot of the religion behind it and the fact that like kind of their inspiration there was interesting, because I had heard about the coffins, but the actual reasoning of like, the funny thing was the coffins had nothing to do with the vampire stuff. He was just rebuilding the bus, and they were going to be cheap wood to make seats in the bus. And so I was like,
but you gotta spin it because you're like, vampires, coffins, that's where they sleep, all that.
Not at all. They had like clothes in there when police entered the house. So that was kind of an interesting thing that had nothing to do with it.
I think for me, I like the 911 response and the 911 operator, and like just kind of like when they were calling and it was a domestic dispute and they were pretty much just saying, oh, this person is blowing it up and what's happening there isn't a big deal. And so it took them a lot longer to respond than maybe they should have. And what could have happened if there would have been that quick response. And so I don't think I think that's glossed over a lot in the media, because we don't want to think that our police aren't going to respond. Now it's more like, okay, it's a reality and we all are recognizing that the police isn't maybe being run the best, but back then that wasn't something that people really focused on, was that, you know, that 911 operator did not do that family justice in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and I think now it's coming to light that for a lot of minorities, that's right on par for how 911 has always treated calls that we make. Because there have been times where I've known people or been a part of situations where, depending on where you're calling from and what your name is, you're not going to get as quick of a response versus like if you're calling like Woodward Park area in Fresno, like the cops are going to be there in a second versus where the Weston case took place off of Belmont near the railroad tracks, like, and it was Hispanic women calling, you're not going to get the response. So this was kind of right on cue for
yeah. It was definitely on brand for, you know, where we were at during that time. And you know, like you said, in general, just kind of involving minorities and locale and things like that. I wonder if part of the story was just so dark and so bizarre that people almost didn't want to go down that rabbit hole. Because I think even as you start to gather some of this information, you almost feel like a little dirty, like reading it and, you know, kind of taking this information in. So, and trying to relate to the situation. So I wonder if it potentially was too deep for many people to where they didn't really want to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility too. And then we talk about it as well. Like we were just coming off of the whole Lacey Peterson stuff and all of the trial and everything going on. And that was in the news for months, like all that was going on. And it was just in Modesto, which isn't too far from us. So it could have been this case of like burnout. Like you hear all of this tragic stuff about this. And now here's this even bigger, like more intense tragedy. And it could have been, I mean.
And it's very taboo. That is a very taboo subject that people are not like readily wanting to talk about, like molestation and incest and rape. And so, and then also a cult.
It's checked a lot of taboo boxes, that's for sure.
It certainly did.
It was definitely a very, very heavy case, very, very taboo. So let's talk about both of you. I think you guys have great chemistry, first and foremost, kind of throughout your episodes. So I think just from the chemistry alone, it's entertaining. But when you're talking about covering like heavy and gruesome topics, yet you're still able to keep it, you know, respectfully entertaining and respectfully lighthearted. How important do you think that is to kind of, you know, your podcast's approach in general?
Oh, I think that's super important. A lot of the podcasts we listen to about true crime, because we listen to both kind of more serious ones and then some with humor. We're kind of in this happy medium where we definitely try to take, when we're talking about the cases, we keep it pretty serious. Obviously, sometimes things come up unrelated to the victims that are funny, like sometimes we burst into song randomly, especially Amber's lived in a lot of places where they have theme songs for a lot of stuff that I have never heard about. So as we go through the Midwest, Amber's singing these little jingles of things she remembers. But I think it's important too, because it kind of gives this lightness to it that, yeah, we're talking about heavy things and we want to remember this and we want to remember these victims, but it's not all, like we don't have to be sad about it every second of the time. Like these victims lived great lives. So we like talking too about the positivity of some of it. I know in my case about the Halloween killer, we kind of talked about this little girl wanted to dress up as a butterfly and her mom made her leave the house dressed as a hobo because it was cold. And like, just, we kind of related it to us. Like she was just this little girl the same way we are, where we would always get kind of frustrated when our parents would dress us up in things that we didn't want it. And so it's just keeping it light, I think, is really important.
Because and also the, you know, the victims, they've had joy in their lives too, and it's not just their murder isn't the defining thing about them. And so making sure, like, we do try to tell their stories, and so how warm. And then we even have times where like we have survivors, so there might be some murder, but you know, there's survivors. So the Utah cabin murders I did, the two daughters survived this horrific thing, and the dad survived after being shot multiple times. And so we have some lightheartedness because, you know, you think about like, oh man, okay, they're surviving. And so you just want to focus kind of some on positive. And then there are some times when things happen that are funny. So my Colorado one, he turned out to be a mass murderer, but like, he did some funny shit. Like he dressed up like this cowboy and he was really weird. And so like kind of making fun of that is, I think, okay.
Colorado was a funny episode because I also had the Spider-Man, the guy who lived up in the attic, like this tiny little attic. This dude lived up there. So they called him the Denver Spider-Man because when the cops actually got there to look, they were like a spider couldn't fit in here. Like what is going on? Like, cause it was such a tiny little living space, but yeah, so we do, and definitely we feel like it's free reign to make fun of the killers because most often than not, they're douchebags. So we're going to call them out and we're going to make fun of them because that's kind of what they deserve.
Yeah,
So.
Celina and I don't mind sharing our opinions on anything. So like you very much know where we stand on everything. We're not ones that like sugarcoat it and are just like, maybe then, you know, no, I'm going to tell you exactly what I think and I'm okay with that. Yeah. If you don't like it, that's okay.
Yeah.
Or if you disagree.
And of course, you have the right to do that. That it's your platform, you know. So I think a lot of people sometimes we do try to get too politically correct because you're worried about, well, what if one person listens and they get upset about it? It's like, well, they don't have to listen. There are other people who can go enjoy as well. So you want to, you know, still maintain that authenticity and not feel like you have to censor yourself for something that you put so much work into. It's not like this is our primary job and we're getting, you know, paid for this.
No.
So yeah, I mean, embrace it. Embrace, you know, the opportunity to put your own content and opinions out there. And if people like it, they like it. If it sparks a debate or conversation, then that's great. More attention around your platform as well. So,
yeah, we definitely encourage them to reach out to us. Let us know if they disagreed with something, like tell us. And we're totally willing to admit if we misinterpreted something and they know more about it, let us know. Like we're open to it.
Yeah.
So let's talk, you know, your introductions into podcasting in general, because have either one of you been a part of a podcast before, State of Murder?
Oh, no.
So let's talk about that origin, because I know for this happens to be my second podcast project that I've been a part of. But going into it, I found myself talking myself out of doing it more than I was talking myself into it, you know, doing it. What were your guys' kind of feelings going into it, and what made you finally decide to pull the trigger and just get it started?
We just decided, hey, let's do something fun. Like if it works, great. If not, at least we tried it. So, I mean, cause we talk about this stuff regularly anyway. So this was kind of just, let's see if other people want to listen to us talk about this stuff. Definitely we've gotten better as we go. So thanks to all of our listeners who stick with us, because listening to those first episodes, it's like, no, those were kind of rough. Like we're getting used to the editing process. And sound quality we're still working on, and and
then like right after our first few episodes, COVID hit, and so then it was like scrambling to figure out, okay, we have to be apart, how are we going to handle that, but like even still powering through that. So, and I think the easiest thing is that Celina and I are really good friends, and I think one of the reasons why we really decided to do a podcast is because we got split up at work. And so we didn't work in the same office anymore. We work in separate buildings. We do separate things. And so we didn't have that opportunity to have that time together and share and have like this kind of just fun engagement that we were so used to having for 40 hours a week. And now we have 0 hours a week together. And so we were like, okay, let's finally do it. We've talked about it. Let's just do it. Bite the bullet, do it.
Yeah. And it's surprisingly like, I mean, it wasn't overly difficult for us to kind of get started. We came up with a plan. We are really blessed with very gifted brothers. So Amber's brother does all of our like artwork for things. He's helping set up our website. He's done all of like the technical stuff. My brother's very musically gifted. So he did our theme intro music. He also, it contributed to some funny intros in our podcast because we tell funny stories about him. Like it just worked out for us that way. We found mics online. We were both pretty good at technology. It just worked out. So we haven't had too much struggles, but we're learning as we go. So
no, that's awesome. I know kind of the origins of, my first project, Fan Culture Podcast. It was a sports podcast with, me and 3 of my friends, where whenever we were together, we would have these constant conversations about sports, like to the point that like it would drive my wife crazy. It would drive, my friend's girlfriend crazy, because just like we would talk for like an hour straight and pay like no attention to them while we're discussing sports and things like that. So we did kind of get to the point where we were like, well, why don't we just start something together and see if people want to participate in the conversation, see if people want to listen. And then as we started, like, you see people are paying attention, and it's like, I guess it kind of, builds up your confidence. But at the same time, we had kind of gotten to the point where it's like, I don't care if anyone listens. If no one listens, and that's fine. If we decide we want to end it, then great, we'll end it and go from there. But I think that initial just jump to just do it is the biggest thing. Just like you both mentioned, you'll figure things out as you go. I mean, I'm still consider myself very amateur. Like, though my editing and stuff, I don't do all the editing that these top podcasts that get hundreds and thousands of views, viewers do. But I figured out something that works for me, ultimately right now, and I'll get better down the road. But definitely once COVID hit, I think that kind of, a lot of people had to think on the fly and figure out how they were going to keep their podcasts up and running. Like, for example, we were recording out of CMAC downtown, and, CMAC had obviously closed down. So it's like, well, what are we going to do? And, then we transitioned to doing Zoom calls, and we're still, doing that, to this day right now. So, just kind of jumping in and just figuring out on the fly. Don't worry about, having the perfect podcast, because you're not going to have the perfect podcast. You're never going to have the perfect podcast in general, but, you can always try to look to find ways to improve. I think that's definitely crucial. So let's talk about the feedback that you have gotten so far regarding State of Murder. What have some people said? What feedback have people given you about the podcast?
So mostly it's been like people we know, friends have reached out to us and said they were really interested. I had one of my friends in Sydney, her, Crystal, she would text me after listening to every episode, and she would put in her 2 cents. She'd be like, this is what me and Oscar thought about this. And she would like tell us what was going on. So we're like, cool. It seems like people are listening. Surprisingly, I had my grandpa tell me that he really enjoyed it. I don't know if he's actually like listening to the content, or if he just likes hearing that it's me like talking about this kind of stuff. But hey, I mean, we're spanning generations now, I guess. So
I think the funnest thing that we do is because you can look on and see where your listenership is. And the fact that our listeners have been all over the world is so crazy to me, because I'm like, what? So like, why is 1/10 of our audience in the United Kingdom? I don't know. I know people in Germany, so I understood the Germany. I was like, okay, I know who those people are listening, but like, we're getting all these other places in like Scandinavia and like
the Czech Republic,
and you're just like, what?
Yeah. So that's pretty cool. Like, it's nice. Yeah, we get listeners Australia, all up and down California. We have listeners. And so, yeah, it's been great. We noticed too, we can tend to see like, okay, we might have more listeners in this state because certain episodes get way more listens, because we're like, okay, either people really like it or that's their state and they like want to know what's going on.
Which it makes it a little hard, because you're like, okay, are they interested in the case that we're talking about, or is it just the fact that we're talking about their state? But like Nebraska, of our biggest ones, and I have a lot of family in Nebraska, so either they're not listening, which is a real asshole thing for them to do, not listen to my podcast and share it, because I would have thought Nebraska and California probably would be some of our top.
Well, California is our top, but that was also because it was our first episode, so I think people were just clicking on to like see what it was all about. So yeah, but don't judge us on our first couple episodes, because while the cases are great, I feel like we're gonna have to go back and maybe revisit them, so that way the quality is a little better, because we're still learning. Our editing wasn't so great, so
which I think we're open and honest about. Even in those episodes, we're like, hey, this is our first podcast, hey, this is our second podcast, like bear with us as we grow. And yeah, I definitely think, I mean, I don't listen to every single one of our episodes, because I just don't, because I don't know how you feel, but it's weird listening to yourself. I feel bad for Celina, because she does all of our editing, and I was like, oh god, I cannot do that. I cannot listen over and over again to my voice.
Yeah, no, I mean, I obviously do the editing for my own podcast, but listening to like a 1-hour episode, and mind you, I'm listening to it like several times, so it's like 4 hours to edit a 1-hour episode. Like, I'm sick of hearing my voice by that point. So once I put it out, I usually don't listen to it again. I just put it out and just move on to the next one because I don't want to hear my voice anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. But talking about the demographics of you, your listeners is really cool because, same thing. I post the podcast on Anchor, and that's where I get like the demographic breakdown and stuff from. Having listeners from Afghanistan, it's like I don't know anyone in Afghanistan. I don't know who the one person is, but seeing like 1% or 2% of your viewership is from Afghanistan is pretty cool. It's like, yeah, someone's listening to it. I don't know if they're continuing to listen into it, but hey, they found my podcast somehow. Little old me from Fresno, California. So that's pretty cool. Nonetheless. Let's see. So what do you enjoy most about podcasting?
I think I just enjoy it. Like Amber said, we're really good friends, and I just enjoy it. It's really like we're just hanging out. Like, yeah, we can't hang out in person right now, but it's nice that that's our catch up. Like, we get to catch up at the end part of our week and just say, hey, like, and usually like we'll just hit record and we just kind of talk about our own stuff, and like sometimes that's where we get a lot of our funny intros is us talking. So if anyone's listened to if you've listened to Illinois, the beginning intro is us trying to time our clapping on our recording, like to try to get it right. And so we just like have fun with it, and we start recording things, and it's just a really nice catch up with a friend that we get to tell each other these stories and talk about it.
And just kind of share our world experiences too. So, I mean, I have been to a lot of the states that we have so far talked about. So I have experiences, and I like sharing about myself. I'm conceited. And so, I think that's really fun, and just getting each other's opinions, because like a lot of times we do lean towards the same politically and just like fundamentally, and just our backgrounds are very similar when it comes to education and everything, but there are still differences between us. I mean, Celina has we have a definite age difference, definitely ethnic, like our ethnicities aren't the same. And so we get like these different perspectives of the world, and I love hearing her opinion on things. And so like even when I'm writing my stories, I'm like, oh, I can't wait until, because I already know Celine's got something to say about this. And so and then waiting for her to have that response is so much fun.
Yeah, no, I definitely enjoy listening to you guys, and yeah, like you said, you're just ultimately having fun with it, and listeners, viewers can feel that. I think that's what makes people, continue to come back, because sure, they could go to another podcast, but is it going to be dry? Is it just going to be stating the facts? People want to be entertained. They want to have something to continue to come back for. People listen to me for an hour on an episode, and it's like, why are you listening to me for an hour? We don't even talk regularly, but because of how you present yourself, they still tune in regularly. So that's pretty cool. So what is next for State of Murder? I know you guys are well over 20 episodes in now. I mean, before you know it, you're going to have all 50 states covered.
Yeah. So, this week's episode is going to be 25, so we're halfway through the country.
Halfway there.
Yeah.
So what's next?
I think I'd like to, once we hit all 50 states, I think doing the territories would be good. So like Guam, Puerto Rico, things like that. And then, I mean, we do have a lot of international listeners, so we might do maybe pick a couple countries and do some cases. And ultimately, I think just backtracking, we're good. I mean, there's more cases to study, because even too, sometimes we are researching what case we want to do, and there's more than one that we're like, okay, which one do I want to do right now? Or which one sounds good? And so going back and being able to pick other episodes, because even too in California, there's so many. And I know Marcus Weston was what we had our heart set on of starting our podcast, because it was something that was close to both of us. But up and down California, you can find more. So being able to do the states over again would be good. Hey, as long as people are listening to us, we'll keep going. So.
And maybe even I've thought about focusing, on some things that aren't, maybe have a commonality through certain things. So one of my friends who listens, he's from Texas, and he wanted us to cover, I can't think of her name right
Vanessa,
now.
You're showing about the soldier?
Yeah, the soldier, thank you. And like that, and so there's there's a lot of stories like hers that aren't ever told and are kind of covered up. And so maybe doing some themed stories, telling a lot of people's like stories very, in a kind of condensed way, just so that you can hear about all these things that aren't necessarily covered or covered up, really.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm definitely not opposed to you guys just doing another lap around the U.S. It's been fun so far. Like you said, you're about to be 25 episodes in, so that is tremendous. You guys are pushing out this content fast, especially with having doing so much thorough research to be able to post weekly is awesome. I'm gonna wrap it up right now, but hang on for like a minute after we do the whole closing, and we'll talk about a couple particulars and stuff.
Okay.
All right. So, State of Murder, thank you guys for joining us, Celina and Amber. It's been a blast. Where can people check you guys out at?
So you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SOM Podcast. You can listen to us pretty much anywhere that podcasts are available. Just look for State of Murder and we pop up. But yeah, and we also have a website, www.stateofmurder.com, where you can find bonus content, our resources that we use, little summaries of the episodes in case you want to know more than what we write on the actual episode itself. So yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, again, thank you, Celina and Amber, so much. It's been a great episode. To the listeners, to the viewers, thank you guys for tuning in again. And until next time, peace.